Do you ever feel like your vote doesn't really matter? Like the people in charge are too far removed, too busy, or too powerful to care? You're not alone, and it's really not your fault. This isn't just about corruption or bad actors, it's outdated infrastructure. A system designed for 13 colonies and 4 million people is now being stretched to serve 333 million people and a global superpower. Today, we'll reimagine what true democracy can be, built for scale, accountability, and real results. Like I said before, in 1790, the US had a population of 4 million people. That meant each House representative represented about 30,000 people. In 1850, the population ballooned to 23 million people. The House grew to 233 seats. The ratio was a little higher, but still under 100,000 people per representative. In 1929, they capped the House at 435 seats. And now, we still have 435 seats, but instead of the ratio that was originally intended for the US, around 30,000 and slightly ballooning up to under 100,000 per representative, it's now 760,000 people per House representative. That's not representation, that's just like crowd management. The origins of the Senate was to appease the lower population states, giving them equal representation in government compared to the higher population states. Today, Wyoming has about 580,000 people, and California is around 40 million. And they have equal representation in the Senate. The presidency evolved from being the steward of the nation, where you have to simultaneously be head of state, head of government, commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, and the economic manager for the country. And this leads to voter apathy and distrust being at historic highs. Power then becomes concentrated in parties, donors, and entrenched incumbents. All of that leads to gridlock, a lot of political theater, and stalled progress. And again, this isn't just about corruption, it's also outdated infrastructure. So one thing I talked about in a video before was something kind of just interesting, and I was kind of playing around with it, but it makes sense in my eyes, is splitting the executive. Really splitting the role reduces the cult of personality that is seen today with many of our current presidents. In the Roman times, consuls shared and checked each other's power. The modern need for something like this is domestic chaos and the global complexity of modern leadership. The domestic affairs president and the foreign affairs president would be elected like a president now with a vice president, but the domestic affairs president would focus on infrastructure, education, healthcare, housing, maybe urban planning, energy and environmental policy, and domestic economic management. The foreign affairs president would focus on national defense and intelligence oversight, diplomacy and international relations, trade agreement and export promotion, sovereign debt and fiscal policies. This brings specialization, but also prevents executive overreach often seen in modern presidencies. The founders of this nation envisioned frequent changes in our representation. The ratio, like I mentioned earlier, was 1 to 30,000, much lower than it is today. To fix this and to align ourselves with other democracies, to get that ratio closer to other economies and closer to what we were, around 110,000 people to one representative, would lead to about 3,000 seats in the Senate. Districts would be redrawn every census to determine the most bipartisan districts and the proper amount of people in each district. You can have districts the size of 330,000 people and then electing the top 3 winners to represent in the House. This makes it a lot easier for third parties and other parties to get into American politics, but also make it fair and much more fair for the voters. This would lead to voters really knowing their rep. There would be much more viability in third parties. Because of the Senate's really disproportionality, it needs to be reworked. Changing the Senate into a sort of house of review, not blocking legislation that gets passed in the House, But sending it back for review, if the House has a 3/4 supermajority over the Senate's revisions, then they can pass without the Senate's revisions. But if the Senate's version is better and the House agrees on that, then they pass that. In modern history, the Senate has kind of become the end all be all in a sense, um, really concentrating power in the small amount of politicians that are elected to the Senate rather than the House, which was supposed to really like represent everybody. And the Senate just kind of refines policy, but their job is still very, very important. And another thing I want to talk about, I believe I've previously talked about it in other videos, and I find it very interesting, is the independent oversight committee. They would be elected for life, but they wouldn't be allowed to have private ownership of things. If they have those things before they get elected, their assets will be frozen, meaning they'll get them back once they leave the position. But their sole purpose would be rooting out corruption in the current system and keeping the government really in check, basically. It's not like Doge that's just gonna like strip like funding everywhere or something, but they would keep bad apples in check and really rooting them out. If politicians are insider trading, they'll get found out by the IOC because their entire job would be rooting out corruption. They would live communally with the other members so they aren't easily corrupted by outside forces like donors or something. They wouldn't be legally allowed to take those things, and if they're found out by other members for taking such things, then they're kicked out and it's illegal. You know what I mean? So they would get charged. So the IOC would have many powers, and to be able to protect whistleblowers if they come to the IOC with something. They can audit spending on public contracts, and they would refer all these matters to the courts. One other thing I also want to talk about too is with the executive branch. With that dual presidency, I find it to be honestly more helpful if there's a removal of term limits. And when you say that off the bat, it kind of sounds like what the hell are you talking about? Like, what do you want to just, you know what I mean? But no, you can have a deliberate system where people can vote on. There can be a sort of like voting process, much like elections and things like that. Like there can be an approval rating for a president during, say, midterms, or when there's like a very serious like scandal or something. Like if a president falls under a certain approval rating, which you don't want to set it too low to where it's like 5%. You want it to be around like 25% approval rating. If they fall under that, they can't run again. If it's an impeachable offense, then of course they'll get impeached. But if they're doing a good job and they're genuinely doing well as, say, a foreign affairs president or a domestic affairs president, why take that away from the nation, you know? 'Cause sometimes some politicians just are good for the country, and sometimes they can get later overwhelmed by having so much power or something, and if they fall under a certain approval rating, then cool, kick them out. You know what I mean? We had FDR through the Great Depression, and this was before like really term limits and stuff like that. So he was president for a very long time, and he really guided the country through the Great Depression, and he did a great job. Had trouble with the gold standard kind of actually lengthening the Great Depression, so he had to deal with it for longer. but he did a great job, and that was with a single executive. Now, if you split the power up between them, they're definitely not as powerful as a single president who could have both powers, right? And I guess there can be an entrenchment, but that's mitigated by the approval rating and kind of having or really promoting a lot of people to go out and vote and share their voice on the president. Because if you truly like this president and you don't go out to vote and they then lose the ability to get reelected because you didn't vote or something, then that kind of sucks, right? But if they're doing well, they're overwhelmingly popular, I don't see why a president should be forced to not be president, you know what I mean, because of 2 terms. I don't know, that's just me. Political and economic redesign go hand in hand. In confluencism, community wealth funds democratize public investment, handing out low interest loans to housing co-ops, small businesses, and taking out the middleman, like banks are today. They're making money with other people's money. And they still have a place in society, but it can be predatory sometimes. And it can really raise the price of housing by a large margin. The fluctuating ownership model aligns worker incentives with their measurable contributions to the business. Proof of economic value tokenizes local value into a reserve asset that can be used to help back new public spending without the worry of inflation. This is how we can become the most democratic nation in the world again. A nation that truly represents the people, not parties, not political dynasties. Democracy is not a relic. It's like a machine. They can and should be redesigned to be better. And that's what we need to do.